Hey everyone, just giving it a couple seconds for people to start joining before I jump in. All right. Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar, From Recognition to Action, Strategies for Developing Diversity Training for Editors. My name is Allison Leung, and I'm a member of the Society for Scholarly Publishing's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Committee, and the manager for product development at the American Chemical Society. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Coalition for Diversity, Inclusion, and Scholarly Communications, or C4DISC. The mission of C4DISC is to work with organizations, individuals to build equity, inclusion, diversity, and accessibility in scholarly communications. C4DISC recently released two fantastic resources, the Anti-Racism Toolkit for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and the Guidelines on Inclusive Language and Images in Scholarly Communications. You can find both of these resources, plus several more, at the C4DISC site at c4disc.org. SSP is a founding member of C4DISC and is proud to be the technology sponsor for this event. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items to review. This webinar is being recorded. You'll be muted automatically in consideration of our speakers and your fellow webinar participants. Closed captioning has been enabled for this webinar, and you can use them by turning on the CC button in the Zoom toolbar. Please use the Q&A feature to send questions to the panelists. You could also use this feature to flag any technical problems you might experience. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Chat has also been enabled if you would like to communicate with other attendees or our panelists. I also want to remind everyone of C4DISC Code of Conduct. The Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion Scholarly Communications is dedicated to creating a harassment-free community for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, religion, or lack thereof, and any other group status. C4DISC will not tolerate harassment of or by members or guests of the community in any form. All speakers and attendees are asked to abide by the code and to conduct their discussions in a fair and respectful manner. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Anna Heredia. Anna is an independent consultant who is an active member of SSP and a regular contributor to the NISO Plus Advisory Committee and to C4DISC. Over to you, Anna.
Apologies. Thank you, Allison, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. Thank you for being with us today. It is a pleasure to moderate this panel with such a great group of speakers. So I'd like to present them to you. We will first have Stephanie Pollack and Annie Hill, respectively Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead and Editorial Director at the American Psychological Association. And then we'll have Shaina Lange, Manager of the Publishing Integrity Office at the American Chemical Society. And to close the panel, we'll have Dr. Joseph Williams, Associate Professor at the University of Virginia and CEO of Affirm Consulting. So I'll leave you with them and see you again at the Q&A session. Enjoy the webinar. It's with you, Annie. Thank you.
My apologies, I'll have it.
Hi there, I'm Steph Pollack. I am the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead for the the Journals program at the American Psychological Association. Thank you so much to C4Disc for hosting this webinar, to Allison Lange for putting this session together, and of course to my fellow co-presenters for inviting me to participate. I'm joining today in a recorded session as I'll actually be out on maternity leave during the live event. So thank you as well to Annie Hill for representing APA Publishing as our editorial director during the live Q&A today. So my talk today is going to focus on APA Publishing's EDI toolkit for journal editors. I'll share a bit about our program as well as some steps that we've taken to support editors in taking action and to measure progress on EDI using this toolkit. So a quick note of clarification, you've heard me use the term EDI. That's APA's preferred acronym for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and it's synonymous with DEI or DEIA, the terms you may hear from my fellow co-presenters today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with APA journals, we're a mid-sized publisher operating within a larger nonprofit organization. So we publish about 90 peer-reviewed journals and 2 specialty products. We received more than 22,000 submissions in 2021 and published just under 5,000 articles that year. And so as a nonprofit membership org, we have a real advantage in that our organization has already embraced EDI engagement across all levels, but particularly from a top-down perspective. So in addition to my role, which is specific to the journals team, to APA Publishing, we have a centralized executive EDI office, which is led by our Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Maisa Akbar. And so Dr. Akbar's team has led several wide-scale, really effective EDI efforts over the last year, including some things like a trio of resolutions that were adopted by the APA Council of Representatives back in last October, acknowledging psychology's role in perpetuating systemic racism and highlighting our responsibility for mitigating those inequities. Related to that, we've had several other resources that our EDI office has published, including our inclusive language guidelines, which is based heavily on APA style, and a racial equity action plan for the organization. So APA Publishing's EDI efforts are really informed by the priorities that are being set, of course, by our centralized executive EDI office, and our own framework, which you can see is shown here. We actually developed in 2019, really as a way to centralize those priorities as they relate specifically to APA Publishing. So one product of that framework is our new EDI toolkit for journal editors. So the toolkit was developed by several members of the APA Journals team of our staff to offer resources and guidelines specific to journal editors for engaging with EDI. So the toolkit itself includes more than 30 recommendations, including some of the resources that you see noted here. So that focuses on everything from steps for setting an inclusive tone for prospective authors to ways that editors can improve representation on their editorial boards, to recommendations for making the science that's reported in their journals more equitable and inclusive. So we actually formatted the toolkit by first including guidance and resources on a wide variety of topics, but each section that addresses a different topic actually concludes with a recommended action that our editors could take to make use of those resources. So we wanted the toolkit to be really as tangible and as user-friendly as possible, and so that we found by not only including resources for further discovery and learning, but also summarizing them with a recommended action at the end of each section was a really effective way to do that. And related to that, at the end of the toolkit, we have a checklist, an EDI checklist for editors that provides, a nice, clean, cohesive summary of the 30 or so recommended actions that you see sprinkled throughout the toolkit. Something else I should note is that we published the toolkit under a CC BY license, meaning that you're not only welcome, but certainly encouraged to share, to adapt the toolkit for your own audiences. Our hope is that the toolkit is applicable and useful, of course, not only to our network of editors, but also to a wider array of editors across different disciplines and fields. So, of course, the logical next question is, how should editors use this document? In training our editors on the use of this toolkit, we really focused on the EDI checklist, which is on page 24 of the file. I forgot to mention in my previous slide, we included a link to the toolkit, which you're welcome to visit. So that's on.apa.org/equity. We certainly encourage you to check it out now or to check it out later. And so on that checklist on page 24, we really use that as a launching point for our editors. And so we included here a quick graphic outlining, how we anticipate editors could use the toolkit for their respective journals and what their process might look like. Something we hope the graphic represents is that EDI work is really iterative and ongoing, and that there is no finish line. So this should be a cyclical experience for all of us. So the first step, of course, is to assess where you are. Our hope is that some of the recommendations that were included in the toolkit are already familiar to some of our editors and to some of you. They're very industry standard recommendations, things like offering public significance statements or impact statements for your articles, encouraging mentored review or student reviewer, co-reviewer programs, that kind of thing. That's relatively common in the industry already, also happens to help facilitate EDI engagement. Our hope there is that, of course, if editors recognize that they are already doing some things to engage with EDI, that allows for a bit more confidence and understanding that they have the power and the capacity to move that work forward. This step also includes looking at preliminary data. So we asked our editors to consider things like, what's the demographic distribution of your journal's authors and editorial boards? What countries are authors submitting from? That kind of thing. What specific areas or subfields are represented or are underrepresented in the content that you're publishing? And can you set goals against a baseline based on those things that you're measuring? Of course, the more data you have, the more capable you are of understanding where you're started so that you can set those more measurable and tangible goals going forward. Of course, once you have that understanding of where you've started, the next step is to identify. So we asked our editors to identify specifically 5 new actions that they could take over the next 12 months to engage with EDI based on the recommendations in the toolkit. We asked them to think about things like, which items on the checklist particularly excite you? Which you see as relatively low-hanging fruit that would be easy to implement, today or in the next week or in the next few months? Which recommendations might have the greatest impact on your specific communities, because that's going to differ based on the needs and the priorities of the different subdisciplines of psychology, and of course of the varying disciplines using this toolkit. Our goal was to have them pick at least 5 items on the checklist that they could launch in the next year, because that's very tangible and measurable. If you know that you are asking yourself to say, okay, here's 5 things I can do over the next 12 months, it's much easier to hold yourself accountable. Related to that, we also wanted to ensure that this was a really collaborative process for our editors. So something we all hear oftentimes in this industry and in this work is that EDI work has to belong to everyone. So we wanted the editors to be really intentional about collaborating with their AEs and with their editorial boards to map out their priorities and to ensure that everyone takes really collective ownership for enabling those actions. So to that end, of course, editors should be leading those efforts, but the hope is that they are also recognizing the value in asking everyone to participate, because that just makes for a much more likely scenario wherein you're actually able to deliver on your goals. Related to that, we also wanted editors to know that they should be collaborating with members of the communities who've been historically excluded from their journals. So you don't want to be in a position where you're implementing priorities for promoting equity for groups that have been historically excluded, and you continue excluding them from that conversation. You obviously have to account for the needs and the priorities and the wants of the communities that you're trying to represent and engage with. So our hope is that editors can very intentionally reach out to, learn from, and understand the needs of the communities that have not been represented in their journals, and use that information to inform the priorities that they're setting. Of course, we want them to communicate once they have set those goals, to share their priorities loudly, either in an editorial or by posting their commitment on the journal website. That, of course, promotes, not only a more authentic tone of inclusion, but it also allows the editors to set them and their teams accountable for the actions that they're trying to prioritize. And like I said before, EDI work is iterative. So you have to reevaluate once you've started this process. You have to continue to assess what's working, what isn't, and how your community's priorities might evolve as you go forward. Something I've heard said is that if you aren't making mistakes in this work and learning from those mistakes, perhaps you aren't doing enough work so far. Making mistakes and learning from them is inherently part of the EDI process, and that's okay. It means that you are pushing yourself to understand and to learn and to do better. We also think this is a really useful time for editors to hold themselves accountable and their editorial boards accountable for the goals that they set at the beginning of that process. So that reevaluation before you start over is a really key step in ensuring that this work continues for the long term. So of course, we also wanted to measure our own project. Once we rolled out this toolkit, we wanted to understand whether or not the recommendations that we have within it are useful, whether the toolkit is being used in the ways that we hoped that it would be. So one of our main priorities for 2022 was to measure the editor's awareness of and application of the recommendations that are mentioned in the toolkit. So we set uptake goals at the beginning of the year for ourselves, for our team, and tracked our progress against them on at least a quarterly basis. So as you can see here, this is a graph outlining the baseline and then the year-to-date uptake of a few different initiatives that were tracked based on the recommendations in the toolkit. And we're glad to say that we've seen growth in editors' adoption across every EDI standard or initiative that we were tracking. So we facilitated that tracking and that uptake in a few different ways in 2022. So first we deployed a survey in the first quarter of the year asking editors first to report on the familiarity with the toolkit because it was still relatively new to our editors. And second, to talk about their level of interest in adopting each of the 30 actions that are outlined in there to really hopefully inform how we and APA Journal staff wanted to focus and prioritize our efforts and our allocation of resources. That really allowed us to understand, which recommendations in the toolkit editors were most excited about, which ones perhaps needed more education or resources in order to make possible, and which ones perhaps could be longer term goals for enabling uptake with our journals. We also hosted several opportunities for editors to really learn from one another at virtual events highlighting some of the recommendations in the toolkit. So that was a really unique opportunity for some editors who had been doing this work for a long time or who had already started engaging in some of these efforts to talk about their own experiences with implementing some of these EDI offerings. And then those editors who were interested in learning more could ask questions, could kind of get a sense of the roadmap that those editors followed to implement some of those offerings. It just made it more accessible and tangible. So we found that peer-to-peer engagement and learning opportunity was a really key point for ensuring that editors felt comfortable in taking some of these actions and learning from one another throughout the process. We also worked with editors one-on-one to identify new EDI actions. So we actually rolled out an update to each journal's homepage earlier this summer, highlighting the journal's EDI efforts and asking editors in that process to select which items they were interested in listing on the homepage. So again, facilitating those one-on-one conversations excuse me, with our editors so that they could ask questions, think about how these specific initiatives relate explicitly to their journals was a great opportunity for them to say, oh, I've been thinking about this for a while. Now's the time for me to actually start implementing some of these offerings to move the journal forward and engaging with EDI. So that's certainly where we saw the most uptake. Of course, it's a very time-intensive process, having those one-on-one conversations with editors and collecting that information from them, but we found it to be really worthwhile because it really allowed many of our editors to take those actions when they had sort of been thinking and sitting on some of their ideas for earlier in the year. So what's next for APA journals? Of course, our EDI work is ongoing, and we have several priorities outlined for 2023 and onward. We're certainly planning on running another round of surveys to our editors on the toolkit's usefulness and on their kind of priorities that they'd like to set against the actions that are recommended in it in the following year, again, to really help map out our resources and our efforts against their plans. Related to that, we'll of course continue tracking uptake, setting new adoption goals for our journals in 2023, and hopefully expanding our efforts to educate our editors, to engage with our editors, and particularly to help facilitate some of these conversations as editors are first starting out, as they're first onboarding into new editor roles. That's obviously a really timely opportunity to encourage them to think about how they can start their tenure with some EDI goals in mind. Of course, we also want this toolkit to be a living document. So we have plans to update that in the coming year, along with new resources that have since published since our initial launch that aren't yet mentioned in the toolkit. That will certainly continue to inform our work in that light. So with that, I will close out. Thank you so much to everyone for your time. Please feel free to connect with me at spollack@apa.org or with Annie Hill, our editorial director, ahill@apa.org. If you have questions or if you're interested in collaborating, we would love to chat more with you about your ideas and your priorities for engaging EDI work with your journal editors. Thank you so much.
Well, after Steph's video, we'll have Shaina Lange talking to us directly. So up to you, Shaina.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second to pull up my slideshow. I'm just confirming you can see my slides.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first, I just want to echo the thank you to C4Disc for hosting this free webinar, to everyone who's organized and contributed to it, and to all of you, of course, for participating. And also, I just want to applaud APA for their EDI efforts. Although we're in very different fields, APA has certainly served as a model and inspiration for the work that we're doing in this space at ACS. As Anna mentioned, I lead ACS's Publishing Integrity Office, supporting our portfolio of about 80 peer-reviewed journals in chemistry and related sciences. And my colleagues and I in the Publishing Integrity Office specialize in publication ethics, research data availability and reproducibility, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and respect, or DEIR efforts, which is my primary focus. So ACS is a nonprofit society and membership organization. We have a very similar advantage that DEIR is widely and unanimously supported by our leadership and governance. And I think that makes a huge difference in what we can dedicate resources to. DEIR is a core value at the ACS, which means it guides all of our programs, products, and services, and it's vital to our vision and mission of advancing the broader chemistry enterprise. So ACS renewed and accelerated its commitment to DEIR in 2020, as did many organizations. And ACS publications, specifically our staff and editorial leadership, published a joint editorial in all ACS journals, which expressed support to marginalized communities, acknowledged known issues within chemistry and within our own journals, and strategically committed to efforts that would sustainably advance DEIR. And one of those commitments was to train our editors to recognize and interrupt bias in peer review. We recognize that our editors are our best partners and champions. And so we really want to empower and equip them to be DEIR leaders at their own journals. And that comes through investing in educational content, resources, and targeted discussions. And our ultimate goal is improving inclusion and equity in peer review. So our approach so far has been one of very much continuous learning. We have over 800 journal editors across our portfolio, spanning over 30 countries, and that number is constantly growing. So with that in mind, we're recognizing that our editors are likely talking about DEIR in very different ways. They're coming to the ACS with different levels of experience. And so our kind of first step is just aiming to acknowledge where editors are in their own journeys and kind of meeting them and where they are. So their existing experiences, their knowledge, their cultural norms, all of that shapes who they are and their behaviors and what they're bringing to their roles as editors. And we're aiming to build on that. So we start with kind of the basic building blocks. Operationally, we provide resources and training on the peer review process, the ins and outs of our submission system. And once they have a good grasp on those kind of ACS procedures, we start setting the conceptual foundation of DEIR, really with the aim of establishing a shared understanding and framework. Those concepts are then applied in a more practical context through on-demand learning modules. And then this is a bit more future thinking for us, but through facilitated discussions, information sharing amongst editors and other kind of evolving on-demand resources, we can continuously ingrain new knowledge and facilitate behavior changes. So today I'm going to focus on how we're setting that foundation, how we're providing that practical content to our editors. So in 2021, as much as we were looking to set a baseline in publications for our editors, ACS as a whole was looking to invest in education for all of our volunteer leaders and governance. So we developed a society-wide interactive workshop for all of our governance, volunteer leaders, and editors. Collectively, I think about 2,500 people. Of that, our editors at the time were around 700. And this is called Leading Inclusively Beyond Lip Service. This training was developed by an external DEI expert, Lange Harris, in collaboration with the ACS Education Division, our ACS Office of DEIR, and other staff. And we conducted a pilot with select volunteer leaders and editors over the course of a couple of weeks in late 2020. And then after making some adjustments, we offered it in March through November 2021 as a 2-hour virtual workshop via Zoom. And we offered over 40 session options where individuals could register for a time slot that worked for them. And that was all through our internal learning management system. The training itself comprised of a mix of presentation, discussion, breakout rooms, and a few kind of running through a few of the topics. So we established a common understanding and language around DEIR at the ACS. We talk about the meaning of DEIR, the value of diversity, to challenge assumptions and invite new perspectives. We talk through the spectrum of human diversity. We kind of go beyond what we might normally talk about in the US, at least around race, gender, geography, and really go into the components of what makes up someone's identity. And there's a screenshot shown on this slide of that part of the workshop here. Through case studies, role-playing, we also help editors identify opportunities in their roles to advance DEIR. So things like, what would you do if this situation happened in a meeting that you were leading or a panel that you were developing? On the slide here is also a picture of Luana's book called Diversity Beyond Lip Service. It's not a required reading for our course, but it touches on a lot of the same topics that the 2-hour workshop touched on. And I am not getting commission for this, but it is a really great quick read if you are interested. And ultimately, the end goal of that workshop too is to get editors buy-in and to kind of establish that same framework, but also to set a shared foundation for which we could grow, future learning opportunities and hold discussions and all kind of be starting from the same baseline. So about 60% of our editors, which at the time was about 400 editors, participated in one of the 40 sessions. For us, training was not required of our editors at the time. So to be honest, we didn't really have a metric in mind. 60% to us felt like a positive metric. Feedback from the course was overall very positive. We heard that cross-journal and cross-functional networking, like I said, our editors were mixed in with other roles across the society leaders. That kind of networking and sharing of experiences was really valuable. But of course, when you have that varying level of backgrounds and roles, how do you ensure that every topic is relevant for everyone? So the one thing that we heard quite a bit was that some of the topics were a bit US-centric, that there were maybe nuances across cultures and regions that we didn't quite hit. Lastly, we heard from our editors specifically that they wanted more application-based practical strategies and resources. This is something we knew going into it that really wasn't the intention of this foundational workshop, but it was the feedback, I think, validated our future plans. Of course, when you're doing anything for the first time like this, we had some challenges and lessons learned. For our editors, at least, the live workshop format was just not scalable or sustainable for us. Knowing that we're constantly bringing on new editors, it was a lot of staff time. So to be able to run a workshop, every time we brought on a cohort of editors probably wasn't going to be feasible for us. We also experienced technical difficulties, even though the workshop was live, just with signing up for the sessions and people logging into Zoom, there's inevitably technical challenges there. Time zone challenges. Like I said, we offered about over 40 sessions, and we thought we kind of covered the spectrum of time zones, but there were still a handful of editors who just couldn't find a good date or time that worked for them. And then when we did have a session that maybe had 3 or 4 people, it really wasn't worth anyone's time to hold a session with that number of people and for our facilitator as well. So we would often cancel those sessions with low registration rates and try to shuffle people around. And I think in that process, we lost folks who really wanted to take the training but couldn't find another time that worked for them. So ultimately, with all of that feedback in mind, with some of those lessons learned, we converted the virtual workshop to an on-demand course. All of that credit goes to my colleague Raquel Jemison in the ACS Office of DEIR, who worked with our facilitator, Luana. And this online course hits the same objectives, but in a much more scalable format than the live workshop. We were able to leverage ACS's existing e-learning platform, the ACS Institute, to host the course and support it. And this online version now serves as a recommended prerequisite for any future learning courses that editors take on this topic. We also conducted focus groups with our editors to better understand their needs. We were fortunate to engage with Dr. Williams, who I know is talking today as well. Dr. Williams facilitated the focus groups, and we also engaged around the same time with an e-learning vendor, and both of whom really helped us develop the next phase of our training. So the next phase of training that we launched is called Advancing DEIR, Practical Strategies for ACS Editors. It's a 1.5-hour on-demand self-paced course available on the ACS Institute and specifically customized for ACS editors. The content was curated and developed in-house in consultation with Dr. Williams, and it was driven by staff expertise and research, and also informed by the feedback from the focus groups I mentioned. The technical development, we had engaged with an e-learning vendor in consultation with our in-house ACS Institute staff. And also shout out to my colleague, Allison, who helped organize this webinar, who is also a critical part of our project team for this training. As the title states, it's focused on practical challenges and opportunities that editors face. So that includes bias awareness throughout the peer review process, examining opportunities where they could support a culture of inclusion. We hit on topics like content commissioning, looking at the scope of your journal and the editorial criteria, reviewer selection, citation bias, how you handle rejection letters and appeals, onto how you recognize researchers for excellence, like the award selection criteria. We also talk about how to engage early career researchers, how to do outreach to underrepresented groups, and diversifying your network. So a lot of our editors, I think a lot of things like reviewer selection or suggesting new editors or advisory board members often comes from within one's network. And so how do you expand that network? What tools can you use to do that? The course itself is mostly made up of reflection-based activities, other interactive exercises. We really wanted to make sure it wasn't just a course where they were being talked at, that we were engaging them asynchronously, but in a way that kind of simulated what would happen if they were actually with other editors in a kind of virtual format. In many cases in our activities, there's really no right or wrong answer. We're trying to more so provide an awareness of their own cognitive biases, implications, what kind of options they might have, and what the implications of maybe going one route versus another might be. There's also a supplementary toolkit and resource list that we provide. The toolkit itself expands on the course. It includes things like sample email language for some of the topics that we talk about in the course. It also links out to a lot of different resources, both ACS and externally. And I have to say too, we are really inspired by APA's toolkit, and we touch on similar topics that are relevant to our journals as well. So we launched this course just in late July a few months ago. Our editors have, for this initial rollout, 6 months to take the course. So we're only halfway through, and we're seeing about a quarter of our editors have taken the course so far. We've just sent out kind of a round of reminders, and we're already seeing to see those numbers increase. Early feedback, though, in the last few months has been really positive, and it really demonstrates the actionable impact of the course, which is exactly what we were hoping for. An overwhelming majority of editors stated that they have practical takeaways and strategies that they plan to implement at their journal. And for us, all of that points to a successful course so far. That said, there are several considerations and lessons learned looking back. The content and course development was very time and resource intensive. Obviously, there are costs in putting together an on-demand course, hosting it and supporting it, but it also, I think, took a lot of staff time to develop and write the content. With that in mind, there's absolutely value in bringing in a subject matter expert or a vendor if you have the funds to consult, which we know not everyone is going to. But I have to say, engaging with Dr. Williams was just really invaluable to our course. So I do encourage, leveraging existing materials and resources as much as possible. Part of what we did was pull things that we already had within our organization and resources, and also things that we were able to find externally that were going to be relevant resources for our editors. Also noting that I think personal experience is a legitimate source of content. Like I said, we ran focus groups, and those were really critical to shaping our content, and also I think increased editors' buy-in in the course, since we were involving them in the development of the course. And of course, practical considerations. So, how to make sure the messaging around the course and requirements is clear. We offered 2 courses at the same time, and that was confusing for editors, even though we thought it was very clear. So just making sure that they're aware of exactly what the course offerings are, what they need to take versus maybe what's recommended or not required. Also thinking about, how do you account for editors rotating off of your board or coming on? Timing, I think, is really important, especially around diversity training. Is there value in providing it right out the gate as soon as they come on board? Or is there value in waiting a bit until they've kind of started getting into more of those operational procedures and the day-to-day role before they engage in a training like this? And lastly, that technical issues are inevitable. I think what's really been important for us is just having a point of contact for editors to go to, knowing that we can help them troubleshoot. Oops, sorry. So yeah, as I said, this is a continuous learning journey for our editors and for our staff, I would say. In terms of what's next for us with our training, we're going to continue to promote both of our online courses and track engagement and feedback. We know it's unlikely that we'll get that 100% completion across 800 plus editors. So we're looking at how we can maximize the use of the toolkit and other resources separate from the course. So if folks don't engage with the course, even though we hope they do, they can still have access to that content. Again, we're still tracking feedback as well, and so there might be some content changes or additional modules that we might add on in the future. And then we're looking ahead beyond this course. How do we continue this conversation, whether it's through facilitated discussions or more resources, panels? That's kind of next on our list. And last slide, thanks again just for allowing me to share what we're doing in the space of the ACS. I think we're all navigating really similar needs for our editors, so I'm always happy to connect and to learn from each other. And with that, Anna, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Shaina. This is an amazing work. I can see from the chat that there are many comments coming, and we are looking forward to hear Dr. Williams. So Dr. Williams, after you.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Anna, for the introduction, as well as thank you to Allison for the invitation and to SSP for hosting this free webinar. Again, excited to be with you here, as well as to see familiar faces such as Stephanie and Shaina in terms of the work that you're actually doing. I'm going to actually share my screen, and so hopefully that actually works. Give me 1 second to do that. Maybe that didn't work. It's gonna be 1 second to reshare that for you. All right, and so hopefully you can see that screen. If not, please let me know, and hopefully it's the correct screen. And so what I'm going to do is really just kind of wrap up what we've been talking about today, which again, I think the presenters before me did a phenomenal job of really talking about the existing resources and how you can use existing resources, as well as kind of creating your own to kind of help you along this DEI related journal. And so what I want to do is actually kind of continue with things to consider. And so this is going to be a slightly different spin on what you previously heard. And so I'm going to advance to the next slide in terms of what are the things you should be taking into consideration as you engage in this work. And so this is like some of the kind of the pre-work discussions that are important to have within your team, wherever you actually might find yourself located. And so I want to just go through 5 really quick sets of questions and exercises in terms of things you should be considering before you go to actually think potentially about actually consulting with the outside external consultant, or again, other things that you might want to do. So this is kind of like the work before the actual work, which again, these are some of the lessons that I've kind of gathered in my time with working with several publishing companies and several profit and nonprofit organizations just across the nation. And so again, these are the questions that I'm oftentimes asking. These are the things that I think it's helpful for publishers, editors, and others to actually kind of consider wrestling with and addressing prior to actually really engaging in some of this work. And so really the first one is the most important one, which is really thinking about describing what the problem. So what is it that you're actually hoping to actually address? And understand that there's many problems along the publication process, and so you can't do all at once. And so again, how do you actually start to prioritize the problem you want to address, and then you use that as a starting point and move forward and build upon that. So building really your foundation. And when I mentioned like what is the specific problem being addressed, and I believe Shaina touched on some of this in her own presentation, thinking about the publication process, right? As this really continuous process, right? From kind of pre-publication to actually post-publication. Understanding that there are tons of ways in which DEI-related issues such as implicit or institutional bias actually shows up, right? In these different spaces, right? And so when we talk about describing the problem, which one of these spaces do you want to start at, right? What is most important as a starting point? And then again, from there, kind of building out and addressing some of the other problems. These are important questions to not necessarily have consensus or finalized, but to be thinking about, right? That again, as was mentioned in Shaina's presentation, that this is a continuous journey, right? So like one course or one webinar actually isn't going to solve it, right? And so this has to be kind of a certain level of commitment that this is actually a long-term endeavor, right? That when we're talking about DEI, that work is actually, it's ongoing. There is no end point, right? It's a long process. And so where do you want to actually start in the process, I think is extremely important. And so I'm going to go back up to that, right? Other things to consider is like, how do things get to be the way that they are, right? As it relates to the problem that you've actually identified. Maybe it's because the problem is so subtle or so implicit that, again, it hasn't really made headways, right? Maybe that, again, there isn't data to actually measure it, to even determine that the problem exists. And oftentimes what I say is that, you know what, how do you define a problem that you don't know exists? And it's a trick question, you don't, right? Someone actually mentioned in the chat earlier, ideas for actually identifying communities who are being excluded from journals, right? So if that's the identified problem, the question becomes is, well, how do you know that's the case? How are you measuring that or not measuring that, right? And again, how are you looking at who publishes in your journals? Who are the reviewers, right? Who are the board members, right? If you're not collecting that data, it's kind of really hard to determine what the problem actually is. And so we always say, you measure what matters, right? So again, the non-existence of data to support this being a problem, or to point to this being actually a viable problem, is a problem in and of itself. And it could be one of the strategies that you choose to do first moving forward, right? I'm always interested in what are some of the attitudes and the beliefs that really led to the situation, right? The situation being the problem that's been identified. What are the things that kind of keep the situation the way that it is? And maybe number 5 is one of my favorite ones that I don't think we wrestle with enough, is how and why has this work actually been deprioritized in the past? The reality is that DEI related issues have always been an issue in publishing in other fields. Why are we just now actually addressing it now? What are the barriers that are preventing us from actually putting this work in the forefront, right? Where it actually belongs, right? And again, that just helps you to think about the barriers and the oppositions that you might face in actually doing some of this work. Once we get into describing the problem, and we talked about the publication process, other things to kind of consider is, what are your intentions, right? Understand that this is the long game that we're talking about playing, right? And so again, are you looking to actually raise awareness about the problem being identified? And again, I'm hoping that you're on the same slides with me. Are you looking to actually build knowledge about the problem that's actually being identified? Or are you actually looking to actually develop skills and strategies about the problem that's been identified? It's usually almost impossible to actually address all these 3 different components with one webinar, with one course. And so again, where do you actually want to start? And I would actually warn against any consultant who says that they can do all these things for you in just one webinar, right? One live discussion or one focus group session. So again, thinking about, what is the main thing I want my editors to take away? What is the main thing I want my authors to take away? My reviewers to take away, right? Board members to take away. I think that's extremely important in terms of thinking about the intentions behind the efforts, right? So you're being very strategic in what you're actually doing. All right, just a few more, and I'm going to wrap it up so we can get into some of the questions that you might have. Another piece of the puzzle is kind of really thinking about, with your team, of like, who's involved, right? So who's affected by the problem? How are they affected, right? What groups are being excluded, to the question that was mentioned earlier in the chat box? Or the groups that are being excluded based on race or ethnicity, based on gender? How about geographical location? Or the groups that seem to be excluded based on, again, the primary language, right? There's a lot of research that actually exists that shows that, again, English-speaking country authors and research labs in those spaces tend to get higher publications, higher citations than non-English speaking countries, being English as the primary language, right? Again, how are you tracking some of these things, right? Who gains or benefits from the way that things are now, right? One of the themes that we kind of heard throughout some of the presentations was really landing upon this concept of representation, right? And who's underrepresented in certain spaces, which topics, which authors, which people, right? And again, if we're thinking about semantics, if underrepresentation actually exists, then there has to be a group that's actually overrepresented, right? And so again, who might have stake in keeping things the way that they are, who might actually have some pushback to that. So again, kind of considering those things, and what are you going to do, right? How are you going to actually address those who might be threatened by an attempt to kind of close some of the gaps that you're actually seeing within your journal, right? Number 6, another important thing to kind of consider, which I always kind of suggest when I'm working with clients, is, again, who's actually doing something about the problem and what are they doing, right? How do we actually use and cite APA's toolkit, which is open to the public, and actually use that material to guide what we're actually doing? This is about not necessarily recreating the wheel, right? Or requesting $1 million budget line to address some of these issues, but to say what actually currently exists and how do we actually leverage that, as Shaina kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. Okay. And we can get into, again, why the problem exists when we think about the process, that understanding that you should think about your publication company, you should think about your journal that you're an editor on, or the book that you're actually working within, the book publishing company, as an institution. Okay. And all institutions are made up of 3 parts. There's the institution part that actually creates the policies and practices and procedures that actually could lead to some of these discrepancies, or lead to contributing to, or maintaining, or perpetuating the problem that you've actually identified. All organizations actually have a culture, right? That is actually made up of people, right? Or excuse me, a culture that's made up of values and norms and ideas and beliefs, as well as all institutions, all organizations actually have the people, right? You know, well attended, oftentimes biased individuals. And so again, where are we actually addressing the problem? Which part do we want to actually address? I think 2 more slides, and then again, we'll be finished. And once again, thinking about what do you want to contribute to the specific problem that's been identified, right? What power or leverage do you actually have? I meet with a lot of companies, a lot of organizations that have these DEI committees that are made up of just maybe 1 or a few folks. There's really no charge, there's really no mission, there's really no power that they can leverage. And so again, considering based on what you want to do, what's within your reach and within your scope, right? Right. And again, how committed are you to staying the course? Again, DEI it's been a buzz kind of trend over the last few years. So what happens when the DEI sector or the DEI kind of buzz actually fades? Will you still be doing this work, or will it be off to the next thing that kind of catches your eye? Right. Things to kind of consider. And how do you communicate, excuse me, that level of commitment to your editors, right? To your readers, right? To other publishers. And again, thinking about your own credibility. And maybe lastly, the one that we don't really think about enough is again, how do you cultivate allies within the spaces that you have? Think about what's your message. And usually it's about some type of erasure of the problem that's been identified. When you think about your groups or your committees that you're part of, how do you handle objections and naysayers? How do you communicate that level of commitment that we just talked about? As well as how do you make space for others to participate with you, right? And so again, just thinking about who's on this webinar right now, that there's enough publishers here right now that again, what are the networks? What are the kind of the coalitions that could exist to actually share in some of this work, share in some of the costs to actually get it? How do you develop courses that we saw with ACS that again, they can be shared among multiple organizations? Things to kind of consider as again, you're engaging in some of this work. And so what I want to do is again, thank you all for the opportunity to kind of present kind of that pre-work reflections that I think it's necessary to at least start to engage in those conversations before you think about tangible things you want to do. I think it helps make the process a little bit smoother. And with that, I want to actually stop sharing my screen and actually turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. This is a great way to finish the set of presentations with a lot of questions. And so I know we have some questions popping up in the chat. I don't know, Alison, if you would like to share those with me or ask them directly.
I think they've all been answered at this point.
Oh, okay.
Shaina has been able to answer them in chat, so.
This is fantastic. So I may ask an open question, and whoever feels to answer it is, I've been thinking about the adoption of all of those principles and material and all the toolkits and by the editors. And I was wondering which are the main obstacles and or the key things that you think are the most important things for editors who want to start implementing DEI principles in their journals. Who wants to go first?
I can just jump in and say, I think one of the major barriers now is just time. And I think that was the case for us as staff when we started developing all of our materials and plans. And that's why we decided to focus on, here are some actions you can take now. I think oftentimes when editors started thinking about this, they thought, oh, I need all these data. And of course, data are incredibly important and we need to understand the landscape of what we're dealing with, also so that we can measure progress. But I think once we had editors sort of identify, here are my first few steps, then they got off. It was just, they were up and running, things are happening, policies are in place at the journal, conversations are happening among the editorial board members, which I think is key because that consensus sort of builds the energy around any initiative you're engaging in. So I think we've tried as staff at APA to make this easier for editors to engage, easier for reviewers to engage in these things, easier for authors to engage in, you know, being a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about the disclosures in their articles, for example. So that's kind of what my answer to the first part of your question. I don't know if others have thoughts.
Yeah, I would completely second all of that. I think staff time, and also editor time. So building off of what Annie just said, as what we're trying to do is really take advantage of that energy that our editors are already showing, and think about how can we facilitate some of these things. If they want to pursue a certain initiative, how can we provide the tools to do that, to make it less burdensome on them, and still allow them to be leading in this space.
And I would agree. I think the short answer on my end would be to start somewhere. That it's all connected. And so again, starting somewhere as a starting place is really great. But both to the points that were actually raised by Anna and Shaina, I'm a really big believer in when it comes to staff time and editors time, that what we're talking about today actually should be like systematically within the roles and responsibility of editors, which means that there should be some things that we're taking off their plates so that we actually can add this, that this is actually something that's that important. If we truly actually value it, that it should be a part of not only our roles and responsibilities, but also how we edit, or excuse me, not edit, but how we evaluate editors and their work and the journals and things of that nature. And again, that's if this is a part of our values, because the values are easy to say or have. We can always put statements up about how we value DEI work and things of that nature. The question becomes is when those values push us to make decisions and choices, which might impact our bottom line, which might actually offend others, then we get to see what we really value as a group. And so again, I just wanted to say that we should really be trying to think about how do we incorporate this into the responsibilities and roles of what editors are asked to do and staff are asked to do. And that's not additional work, but it's to take things off and add this as kind of central to some of the things they're doing.
Thank you. There is a question that I think it's very nice. So I'm taking a little time to ask this. This is any advice for students run journals?
I'll jump in really quickly. I'm not sure that anything said today doesn't actually translate to student-run journals. So I think it translates really nicely, right? And so again, hopefully there's ways in which we're mentoring student editors and others around some of these same topics. We're sharing resources with these student-run journals and editors, so I think there's things that we're talking about today that it all really translates over. But again, also thinking about how we can provide additional support to those individuals, those students as well.
Thank you so much. Allison, you would like to?
Yeah, there was a question that came in from chat that was for Dr. Williams, which is how do you handle naysayers?
So I'm probably the worst person to ask that question to, because I don't. So I choose to spend most of my time incentivizing those who are actually already engaged in the work and who actually believe that this work is actually important, versus using a lot of time and energy and resources trying to convince others of the importance of this work. By incentivizing this work and the importance of the work, I think we start to create a culture where those who are the naysayers, they start to self-select out of our journals, out of our publication companies, and others who actually are outside looking in, and they see what we value in the work that we're doing, they're going to be attracted to what we're doing. And so I'm more interested in changing the culture and how do we reward those who are doing the work versus how do we spend a lot of time and mental energy trying to convince people of the importance of this. If it's truly a value of your organization, what we're talking about today is embedded in all the decisions that you actually make. It's always a consideration. It's the frame in which you actually do your work. And so again, those who are the naysayers, it would be a really uncomfortable place for them to be in if, again, we're really kind of living out that value we have. And so I choose not to commit a lot of time and energy in convincing naysayers of the importance of this work. But that's just my opinion, which sometimes is unpopular.
Any other comments or any other question from the audience? So if not, I'll leave you with Allison to close up this interesting panel. Thank you so much, Annie, Shaina, Joseph, for being here with us today. I think we are having great comments on the chat, so people are happy, and so we are. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all for your participation today in today's C4Disc webinar. And thanks, of course, to the speakers and to Anna, the moderator, for this really engaging presentation. The webinar was recorded, so it's going to be shared with all the registrants, and a link to the recording is going to be sent via email afterwards. So thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.